Hey guys, welcome back. I know it's been a little while since my last video. I've been pretty busy lately, so I've been trying my best to record on my days off. But now, since I started a little bit later, I'm going to try and record a video every single day, so you guys can still get content and not have to wait so long for it. But yeah, I hope you guys liked the last one. And let's see what this chapter has to offer. So Chapter 10, The Other Civil War. A sheriff in the Hudson River Valley, near Albany, New York, about to go into the hills in the fall of 1839 to collect bank rents from tenants on the enormous Rensselaer estate, was handed a letter. The tenants have organized themselves into a body, resolved or not, pay any more rent until they can be redressed of their grievances. The tenants now assume the right of doing to their landlord as he has for a long time done to them, viz. As they please. You need not think this be children's play. If you come out in your official capacity, I would not pledge for your safe return. A tenant. When a deputy arrived in the farming area with writs demanding the rent, farmers suddenly appeared. Assembled by the blowing of tin horns, they seized his writs and burned them. That December, a sheriff in a mounted pose of 500 rode into the farm country, but found themselves in the midst of a shrinking tin horns. 1,800 farmers blocking their path, 600 more blocking the rear, all mounted, armed with pitchforks and clubs. The sheriff and his post turned back, the rear guard parting to let them through. This was the start of the anti-renter movement in the Hudson Valley, described by Henry Cushman and the Tim Horns and Calico. It was a protest against the patronship system, which went back to the late 1600s when the Dutch ruled New York, a system where, as a Cushman described it, quote, a few families intricately intermarried controlled the destinies of 300,000 people and ruled in almost kingly splendor near 2 million acres of land, end quote. Now that is so relatable to today, because you see right now with a lot of people being evicted or threatened with eviction or can't afford rent, and they're tired of having the rents being jacked up and the prices of new apartment complexes and high-rises being too expensive. This is kind of really close to today. The tenants pay taxes and rents. The largest manor was owned by the Rensselaer family, which ruled over about 80,000 tenants and had accumulated a fortune of $41 million. The landowner, as one sympathizer of the tenants put it, could, quote, swill his wine, loll on his cushions, fill his life with society, food, and culture, ride his barouche and 5 saddled horses along the beautiful river valley and up to the backdrop of the mountain, end quote. By the summer of 1839, the tenants were holding their first mass meeting. The economic crisis of 1837 had filled the area with unemployed seeking land. On top of the layoffs accompanying the completion of the Erie Canal, after the first wave of railroad building ended, this summer the tenants resolved, quote, we will take up the ball of the revolution where our fathers stopped, and it rule it to the final consummation of freedom and independence of the masses, end quote. Certain men in the farm country became leaders and organizers. Smith Broughton, a country doctor on horseback, Inge de Vere, a revolutionary Irishman. De Vere had seen monopoly of land and industry bring misery to the slum dwellers of London, Liverpool, and Glasgow. Had agitated for change, had been arrested for sedition, had fled to America. He was invited to address a 4th of July rally of farmers in Rensselaerville, where he warned his listeners, quote, if you'll permit unprincipled and ambitious men to monopolize the soil, they will become masters of the country, and the certain order of cause in effect, end quote. Thousands of farmers in Rensselaer country were organizing into anti-rent associations to prevent the landlords from evicting. They agreed on Calico Indian customs, symbol of the Boston Tea Party and recalling original ownership of the soil. The tin horn represented an Indian call to arms. Soon 10,000 men were trained and ready. Organizing went on in country, county after county, and dozens of towns along the Hudson handbills appeared. Attention! Anti-renters awake! Arouse! Strike till the last orange fur expires. Strike for your altars and your fires. Strike for the green graves of your sires, God in your happy homes. Sheriff and deputy sheriffs, trying to serve writs on farmers, were surrounded by calico-clad raiders, who had been summoned by tin horns surrounding the countryside. Then tarred and feathered. The Boston Herald, once sympathetic, now deplored, quote, the insurrectionary spirit of the mountaineers, end quote. One of the most hated elements of these gave the landlord the right to the timber and all the farms. A man sent onto a tenant's land to gather wood for the landlord was killed. Tension rose. A farm boy was killed mysteriously. No one knew by whom, but Dr. Bodden, who was jailed, the governor ordered artillerymen to action, and a company of cavalry came up from New York City. Petitions for an anti-rent bill signed by 25,000 tenants were put before the legislature in 1845. The bill was defeated, and kind of guerrilla war resumed in the country between bands of, quote, Indians and sheriffs, possesses. Bond was kept in jail 7 months, 4.5 months of that and heavy irons, before being released on bail. 4th of July meetings in 1845, attended by thousands of farmers, pledged to continue resistance. When a deputy sheriff tried to sell the livestock of a farmer named Moses Earl, who owned $60 rent on 160 stony acres, there was a fight and the deputy was killed. Similar attempts to sell livestock for rent payments were thwarted again and again. The governor sent 300 troops in, declaring a state of rebellion existed. And soon almost 100 anti-renters were in jail. Smith Bodden was brought to trial. He was charged with taking papers from a sheriff but declared by the judge to have committed, quote, high treason, rebellion against your government, and armed insurrection, and sentenced to life in prison. Those, quote, Indians, found to be armed and disguised at Moses Earl's farm, where the deputy had been killed, and disguised as Moses Earl's guilty of murder, and the jury was so instructed, all were found guilty, and the judge sentenced 4 to life in prison and 2 to be hanged. 2 of the leaders were told to write letters urging the anti-renters to disband. As their only chance to escape the heavy sentences, they wrote the letters. The power of the law thus crushed the anti-rent movement. It was intended to make clear that farmers could not win by fighting, that they must confine their efforts to voting, to acceptable methods of reform. And again, that is something we're seeing today. No striking, no movements, no protests, no any form of meetings. You should just go and vote, and everything will be fine. Well, we can tell from here, that doesn't happen that way. So in 1845, the anti-renters elected 14 members to the state legislature. Governor Silas Wright now commuted to life imprisonment and the 2 death sentences and asked the legislature to give relief to the tenants, to end the feudal system in the Hudson Valley. Proposals to break up the huge estates on the death of the owner were defeated. But the legislature voted to make illegal the selling of tenant property for non-payment of rent. A constitutional convention that year outlawed new feudal leases. The next governor, elected in 1846 with anti-rent support, had promised to pardon the anti-prisoners, and he did. The throngs of farmers greeted them on their release. Court decisions in the 1850s began to limit the worst features of the manorial system, without changing the fundamentals of landlord-tenant relations. Sporadic farmer resistance to the collection of back renters continued in the 1860s. As of late 1869, bands of, quote, Indians were still assembling to thwart sheriffs acting for a Ridge Valley landowner named Walter Church. In the early 1880s, a deputy sheriff trying to dispossess a farmer on behalf of Church was killed by shotgun fire. By this time, most leases had passed into the hands of the farmers in 3 of the Maine anti-renter counties. Of 12,000 farmers, only 2,000 remained under lease. The farmers had fought, being crushed by the law, their struggle diverting to voting, and the system stabilized by enlarging the class of small landowners, leaving the basic structure of rich and poor intact. It was a common sequence in American history. Around the time of the anti-renter movement in New York, there was excitement in Rhode Island over Dorr's Rebellion. As Marvin Gentleman points out in the Dorr Rebellion, it was both a movement for electoral reform and an example of radical insurgency. It was prompted by the Rhode Island Charter's rule that only owners of land could vote. And you have to remember that in the early Americans, I would say for the first almost 200 years, no one could vote besides white men with land. Well, white men without land, white men with land and white men without land, and then later, the blacks, quote-unquote, got the right to vote, and then the early 1900s, around 1920s, the women got the right to vote. See a pattern? As more people left the farm for the city, as immigrants came to work in the mills, the disenfranchised grew. Seth Luther, self-educated carpenter of Providence and spokesman for working people, wrote in 1833 the, quote, Address on the Right of Free Suffrage, denouncing the monopoly of political power by, quote, the mushroom lordlings, sprigs of nobility, small potato aristocrats. Of Rhode Island, he urged non-cooperation with the government, refusing to pay taxes or to serve in the militia. Why? He asked he should 12,000 working people in Rhode Island without the vote submit to 5,000 who had land and could vote? Doesn't make sense, does it? Thomas Dorr, a lawyer from well-to-do family, became a leader of the suffrage movement. Working people formed the Rhode Island Suffrage Association. In the spring of 1841, thousands paraded in Providence, carrying banners and signs for electoral reform. Going outside the legal system, they organized their own, quote, People's Convention, and drafted a new constitution without property qualifications for voting. In early 1842, they invited votes on the Constitution. 14,000 voted for it, including about 5,000 with property. Therefore, a majority of even those legally entitled to vote by the charter. In April, they held an unofficial election in which Dorr ran unopposed for governor, and 6,000 people voted for him. The governor of Rhode Island, in the meantime, got the promise of President John Tyler that in the case of rebellion, federal troops would be sent. There was a clause in the U.S. Constitution to meet just the kind of situation, providing for federal intervention to quell local insurrections on request of a state government. Ignoring this, on May 3, 1842, the Dorr forces held an inauguration with a great parade of artisans, shopkeepers, mechanics, and militia marching through Providence. The newly elected People's Legislature was convened. Dorr led a fiasco of an attack on the state arsenal. His cannon misfiring, Dorr's arrest was ordered by the regular governor, and he went into hiding outside the state, trying to raise militia support. Despite the protest of Dorr and a few others, the, quote, People's Constitution kept the word white and its legal clause designating voters. Angry Rhode Island blacks now joined the militia units of the Law and Order Coalition. which promised that a new constitutional convention would give them the right to vote. When Dorr returned to Rhode Island, he found several hundred of his followers, mostly working people willing to fight for the people's constitution. But there were thousands in the regular militia on the side of the state. The rebellion disintegrated, and Dorr again fled Rhode Island. Martial law was declared. One rebel soldier, captured, was blindfolded and put before a firing squad, which fired with blank bullets. 100 other militia were taken prisoner. One of them described their being bound by ropes into platoons of 8, marched on foot 16 miles to Providence. Quote, threatened and pricked by the bayonet. If we lagged from fatigue, the rope severely chafing our arms. The skin of mine, no water till we reached Greenville. No food until the next day. And after being exhibited, we put into the state prison. A new constitution offered some reform. It still gave overrepresentation to the rural areas, limited the vote to property owners or those who paid $1 poll tax. And you're going to see this a lot in the South, to prevent African Americans from voting, and would let naturalized citizens vote only if they had $134 in real estate. Means testing. In the elections of early 1843, the Law and Order group, opposed by former Dorrites, used intimidation of state militia, of employees by employers, of tenants by landlords, to get out their vote. It lost in the industrial towns, but they got the vote for the agrarian of the agrarian areas and won all major offices. Dorr returned to Rhode Island in the fall of 1843. He was arrested on the streets of Providence and tried for treason. The jury instructed by the judge to ignore all political arguments and consider only whether Dorr had committed certain overt acts which he never denied committing. Found him guilty. Whereupon the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment at hard labor. He spent 20 months in jail, and then a newly elected Law and Order governor, anxious to end Dorr's martyrdom, pardoned him. Armed forces had failed. The ballot had failed. The courts had taken the side of the conservatives. The Dorr movement now went to the U.S. Supreme Court via a trespass suit by Martin Luther against Law and Order militiamen, charging that the people's government was the legitimate government in Rhode Island in 1842. Daniel Webster argued against the Dorrites. If people could claim a constitutional right to overthrow an existing government, Webster said, there would be no law and no more government. There would be anarchy. In a decision, the Supreme Court established Luther v. Borden, 1849, a long-lasting doctrine. It would not interfere in certain, quote, political questions, to be left to executive and legislature. The decision reinforced the essentially conservative nature of the Supreme Court, that on non-critical issues, war and revolution, it would defer to the President and Congress. Because right now you are seeing the evolution of the federal government and the Supreme Court saying, we have powers for this, the federal government has powers for this, and the state government has the powers of this. The stories of the anti-renter movement and Dorr's rebellion are not usually found in textbooks on the United States history. And these books given to millions of young people, there is little on class struggle in the 19th century. The period before and after the Civil War were filled with politics, elections, slavery, and race question. Even when specialized books on the Jacksonian period deal with labor and some economic issues, they center on the presidency and thus perpetuate the additional dependency on heroic leaders rather than people's struggles. Because they don't want us to learn labor movements were out there, class solidarity, working together to write up a constitution that's fair. They don't want us knowing that, and that's why the textbooks are written that way. Andrew Jackson said it. He spoke for, quote, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers. That was subject to change. He certainly did not speak for the Indians, being pushed off their lands or slaves. You don't say. But the tension aroused by the developing factory system, the growing immigration required that the government develop a mass base of support among whites. Jacksonian Democracy did just that. Politics in this period of the 1830s and 40s, according to Douglas Miller, a specialist in the Jacksonian period, the birth of modern America, quote, had become increasingly centered around creating a popular image and flattering the common man. Miller is dubious, however, about the accuracy of the phrase, quote, Jacksonian Democracy. Parades, picnics, and campaigns, a personal slander, characterized Jacksonian politicking. But, although both parties aimed their rhetoric toward the people and mouthed the sacred shibboleths of democracy, this did not mean that the common man ruled America. The professional politicians coming to the fore in the 20s and 30s, though sometimes self-made, were seldom ordinary. Both major parties were controlled largely by men of wealth and ambition. Lawyers, newspapers, editors, and merchants, industrialists, large landowners, and speculators dominated the Democrats as well as the Whigs. Jackson was the first president to master liberal theater rhetoric to speak for the common man. This was a necessity for political victory. When the vote was being demanded, as in Rhode Island, by more and more people, and state legislatures were loosening voting restrictions. As another Jacksonian scholar, Robert Rimini, The Age of Jackson, says, after studying electoral figures for 1828 and 32, Jackson himself enjoyed widespread support that ranged across all classes and sections of the country. He attracted farmers, mechanics, laborers, professionals, and even businessmen. All of this without Jackson being clearly pro or anti-labor, pro or anti-business, pro anti-landowner, middle or upper class. It has been demonstrated that he was a strikebreaker. Jackson sent troops to control rebellious workers on the Chesapeake and Oil Canal. Yet at different times, he and the Democrats received the backing of organized labor. It was a new politics of ambiguity, speaking for the lower and middle classes to get their support in times of rapid growth and potential turmoil. The two-party system came to its own in this timeline, to give people a choice between two different parties and allow them. And a period of rebellion, to choose slightly the more democratic one, was an ingenious mode of control. Like so much in the American system, it was no devilishly contrived by some master plotters and developed naturally out of the needs of the situation. Rimini companies that Jacksonian Democrat Varman Viren, who succeeded Jackson as president, with the Austrian conservative statesman Metternich, quote, like Metternich, who was seeking to thwart the revolutionary discontent in Europe. Von Buren and similar politicians were attempting to banish political disorder from the United States by balance of power achieved through two well-organized and active political parties. End quote. The Jacksonian idea was to achieve stability and control by winning the Democratic Party, quote, the middling interest, and especially the substantial majority of the country, by, quote, prudent, judicious, and well considered return. That is, reform that would not yield somewhat too much. There were the words of Robert Rantoul, a reformer, corporation lawyer, and a Jacksonian Democrat. It was a forecast of the successful appeal of the Democratic Party, and at times the Republican Party, in the 20th century. Such new forms of political control were needed. In the turbulence of growth, the possibility of rebellion, now there were canals, railroads, the telegraph. In 1790, fewer than 1 million Americans lived in cities. In 1840, that figure was 11 million. New York had 130 100,000 people in 1820, a million by 1860. And while the traveler Alexis de Tocqueville had expressed astonishment at, quote, the general equality of condition among the people, he was not very good in numbers. His friend Beaumont said, and his observation was not in accord with the facts. According to Edward Pesson, a historian of Jacksonian Democracy, or just Jacksonian Society, or Jacksonian America, in Philadelphia, working-class families lived 55 to a tenement, usually one room per family, with no garbage removal, no toilets, no fresh air or water. There was fresh water nearly pumped from the Schuylkill River, but it was going to the homes of the rich. In New York, you could see the poor lying in the streets with the garbage. There were no sewers in the slums, and filthy water drained into yards and alleys, and to the cellars where the poorest of the poor lived, bringing with it a typhoid epidemic in 1837, typhus in 1842, and the cholera epidemic of 1832. The rich said fled the city, the poor stayed and died. The poor could not be counted on as the political allies of the government, but they were, like slaves or Indians, invisible ordinarily, a menace if they rose. Remember that. There were more solid citizens, however, who might give steady support to the system, better paid workers, landowners, and farmers. Also, there was the new urban white-collar workers, born in the rising commerce of the time, described by Thomas Cochrane and William Miller, the age of enterprise. Dressed in drab alpaca, hunched over a high desk, this new worker credited and debited, indexed and filed, and stamped invoices, acceptances, bills of lading, receipts, adequately paid. He had some extra money and leisure time. He patronized sporting events and theaters, savings banks, and insurance companies. He read Day's New York, Sun, or Bennett's Herald. The, quote, penny press, supported by advertising, filled with police reports, crime rates, etiquette advice for the rising bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie is the upper class, the proletariat is the middle class and poor. This was the advance guard of a growing class of white-collar workers and professionals in America who would be woed enough and paid enough to consider themselves members of the bourgeoisie class and to give support to the class in time of crisis. The opening of the West was being helped by mechanization of the farm. Iron plows kept plowing time in half. By the 1850s, John Deere Company was turning out 10,000 plows a year. Cyrus McCormick was making 1,000 mechanical reapers a year in his factory in Chicago. A man with a sickle could cut half an acre of wheat in a day. With the reaper, he could cut 10 acres. Turnpikes, canals, and railroads were bringing more people west, more products east, and it became important to keep the new West tumultuous and unpredictable and under control. When colleges were established out west, Eastern businessmen, as Cochrane and Miller say, quote, were determined from the start to control Western education, unquote. Edward Everett, the Massachusetts politician and orator, spoke in 1833 on behalf of giving financial aid to Western colleges. Let no Boston capitalist then, let no man who has a large stake in New England, that think he can call upon to exercise his liberality at a distance toward those in whom he has no concern. That I ask you to give security to your own property by diffusing the means of light and truth throughout the region where so much the power to preserve or to shake it resides. The capitalists of the East were conscious of the need for this, quote, security to your own property, unquote. As technology developed, more capital was needed, more risks had to be taken, and a big investment needed stability. An economic system not rationally planned for human need, but developed fitfully, chaotically out of the profit motive, there seemed to be no way to avoid recurrent booms and anti-slumps. There was a slump in 1837, and another in 1853. One way to achieve stability was to decrease competition organized the businesses, moved more toward monopoly. In the 1850s, price agreements and mergers became frequent. The New York Central Railroad was a merger of many railroads. The American Brass Association was formed, quote, to meet ruinous competition, unquote. It said the Hampton County Cotton Spinners Association was organized to control prices, so there was the American Iron Association. Another way to minimize risk was to make sure the government played its traditional role, going back to Alexander Hamilton and the First Congress. Of helping the business interest, state legislatures gave charters to corporations, giving them legal rights to conduct business, raise money, and first special charters. Then general charters so that any businessman meeting certain requirements could incorporate between 1790 and 1860 2,300 chartered. Railroad men traveled to Washington and the state capitals armed with money, shares of stock, free railroad passes. Between 1850 and 57, they got 25 million acres of public land, free of charge, and millions of dollars in land loans from the state legislatures. In Wisconsin, 1856, the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad got 1 million acres free by distributing about $900,000 in stocks and bonds to 59 assemblymen, 13 senators, the governor, and 2 years later, the railroad was bankrupt and the bonds were worthless. And these mill owners had become powerful and organized. By 1850, 15 Boston families were called the Associates, controlled by 20% of the cotton spindleage in the United States, 9% of insurance capital in Massachusetts, and 40% of baking resources in Boston. In the school books, those years were filled with the controversy near slavery, but on the eve of the Civil War, it was money and profit, not the movement against slavery. That was uppermost in the priorities of the men who ran the country. As Cochrane and Miller put it, quote, Webster was the hero of the North, not Emerson, Parker, Garrison, or Phillips. Webster was the tariff man, the spine speculator, the corporation lawyer, politician for the Boston Associates, and head of Hamilton's coronet. Quote, the great object of government, unquote, he said, quote, is the protection of the property at home, and respect and renown abroad. For those he preached union, for these he surrendered the fugitive slaves. Alright guys, thank you for watching. This is part 1 of chapter 10. I will have part 2 up tomorrow. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Always feel free to share your thoughts and comments down below. And have a great day.